Medical Mariner Inc.
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you live from our Norfolk studio, home of the Atlantic Fleet, Medical Mariner Inc.
Hello and welcome to Medical Mariner Inc. I'm your host, Paul Stewart. This podcast is going to cover my journey in life, some things I have learned. We will talk about medicine, about PA school, about changing careers, about tattoos, and scuba diving, technical diving. Might even talk about skydiving in there, growing things, resilient living, training, anything else that comes to mind. I will attempt to get some folks on here now and then to talk about things with us, and we'll see where this journey goes. Thanks for listening, and now here's today's episode. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Medical Mariner Inc. Today's episode is called Church in Africa, and we're going to talk some about the churches I have attended while over there and some of the interesting things that happened while I was there. So Church in Africa, it's not been anything like any church I've been to in America. Every one of them's a little bit different, but they're all seriously different than what is going on over here. I think the biggest thing I have noticed is that you get into these situations where people would be just so challenged over here in America and complaining so much about their situation, and they are all just extremely happy to be in there and praising Jesus, praising God, and it's just awesome to be there and be part of it. So when I go to compare church in Africa to church in America, one of the big differences is just the poverty level and the difference between the two. I've often told people that even the poorest person that I've ever run into in America, they are so much more immensely rich than most of the folks in Uganda because they have society resources they can fall back on, and that's just not an option for most of the people in Uganda. A lot of the homes you go into, and even a lot of the buildings, church buildings and business buildings in general, they do not have electricity. Ones that do have the utility electricity coming in, it's very unreliable. I have heard that a lot of times the reason they don't have electricity in Uganda is because the power company can make more money selling that electricity to Kenya than it can by selling it to the local businesses and people in Uganda. It's not uncommon for a group of orphans to live together as a family group and have no adult with them, where the oldest child may be a teenager, might even be 10 or 11 years old, and you've got a group of 5 or 6 kids and they're just trying to take care of each other and get by. Healthcare, it's not guaranteed in Uganda. You don't have anything like Mtala where you can go to an emergency room and they have to treat you. They will turn patients away from the hospital if they don't have the money up front for treatment, if they don't have their own dressings and bandages with them, and if they don't have someone to provide food for them or cook for them while they're in the hospital, they're not going to eat. Food can be pretty scarce. In a lot of the remote areas, items like soda and prepackaged stuff, it's very rare. And if they have it at all, it's an amazing gift if they try to give it to you. A lot of the cooking there is done on outdoor fires. So you don't have a lot of people who have indoor things like stoves and ovens. One of my friends one time when we were getting off the plane going to Africa, we got out and he goes, that campfire smell, I can tell I'm back in Africa. The whole country smells like that because of the outdoor fires. Another weird thing that you see over there where you're used to, if you've got bricks that you're going to use in construction, you go down to Home Depot or whatever and you buy the bricks. When I've seen in Uganda, you'll go by driving along and there'll be these large stacks of bricks on the side of the road. And it turns out those are actually brick kilns that the people have made the mud bricks themselves, dried them, stacked them up in such a way that when they build a large fire inside and around them, it fires the bricks and makes them so that they can use them then in their construction. One of the other things that I've found really interesting that differs in Africa and America that's not necessarily directly related to the church experiences. When you go to the national park, it's not like you go wandering around in the park over there. They have things out in the park that can and frequently do eat or trample tourists. So it's not uncommon to hear one of the park guides to say, excuse me, you must be very careful. Remember, you are in the park. So the first church I attended in Africa was in a village called Bunyinza. That's about an hour and a half, 2 hours away from Tororo, which is one of the towns over on the southeast side near the Malaba River crossing into Kenya. The first church I went to was there, and it was a village that the church I was attending in America was sponsoring. The church in Bunyinza, it's a single room brick building. It's probably maybe 1,800 square feet on the inside, very simple poured concrete construction. There are no pews or benches or anything. It's just an open air spot. When I went into the village for the first time, there was a field off to the side that's kind of the community farming area, and they had a lot of cows tied up there. One of the things that's interesting in Uganda is if you bring a soccer ball and just drop it in the middle of the field, it's going to disappear instantly as everybody in that village or area starts playing with it. They had this incredible game of football. That's what we call soccer in Uganda. That's what much of the world calls soccer. In America, we call it soccer because football was stolen by something that you don't use your feet on the ball. So don't understand that at all. They got this big football game going. In that field, everybody's kicking it around, and the cows, when they have cows in the field in Uganda, they usually have a rope tied to one leg of the cow. The rope's on a stake, and the cow is there. Well, I asked somebody, why don't they just move the cows? And they're like, that would be stealing, and we don't steal people's cows in Uganda. So everybody played around the cows. One of the fellows who was playing on that team, he was really good, and I asked somebody about it, and they said, well, he used to be on the national team, but he couldn't afford to pay for the travel when the team was going internationally, so he had to drop off the team. To give you an idea of what goes on in professional sports in Uganda. So anyway, we're back to the church. It's a concrete building. It had no electricity. We had a fellow with us, his name's Andrew. He was a keyboard player, so he could power his keyboard. We actually brought a gasoline generator and gasoline, they call it petrol over there, with us, and set that outside, and he set up so he could play music. When we got in there and started playing the music, it wasn't like in America where everybody calmly stands up, maybe raises their hands in the air. Everybody's jumping, they're screaming, they're having a good time, they're holding chairs up in the air. I found out later that when folks brought chairs with them so that they could sit on them or use it for someone else to sit on, the reason they're holding the chairs up is because that makes them feel like they are getting closer to heaven. Everybody showed up from all over the place. They were coming out of, I don't know where. And it was amazing. There was standing room only in that church, and there were people around outside. Now, granted, some of that might have been due to the fact that they knew that there was a foreign presence in the area, and that often attracts attention. But worship services, church services are usually extremely well attended in Uganda. Another thing that was very different about that service than anything I'd seen in America is it went on for hours. I mean, if memory serves, more than 4 hours. And when our group left, it was still going strong and kept going even after we were out of the area. So when they do church over there in Bunyinza, they do it all day long. Now, the second church experience I'm going to talk about is out past Busia. Busia is another small town that is probably 2.5 hours away from Tororo as well, but in a different direction than Bunyinza was. When I talk about us driving on these roads, that probably deserves a little bit of an explanation. What they call a road out there, if you're not on the main like Kampala-Jinja Road or the road that goes from Kampala to Kasese or Fort Portal, over here you wouldn't call it a road. You'd call it a Jeep trail. There's ruts, there's holes, there's puddles, they're not paved, they're dirt. And frankly, I was on my first several trips over there impressed at the places you would see people take a sedan or a bus and get through that most Americans wouldn't touch without some type of four-wheel drive vehicle with some type of elevation. So the way I got to go to this church, where there was a young fellow, I forget what his name is off the top of my head. I think he was 17 or 18 years old, and his family had made a lot of donations in this village that was out. And at first, just he was going to go out there and go to church all by himself. This was on my first trip to Africa. This is when I was still not exactly certain what the security environment was over there. So I thought, there's no way I'm letting this young guy go out there by himself. So I said, do you mind if I tag along? And we got in a car with our driver and our escort that was taking us out there, and we started driving and driving and driving. Now, unbeknownst to me, we get about halfway there and we had to stop. And I asked the driver why we were stopping. He says, to fix car. Okay. So we stopped. We were in this other town area. I don't know that it specifically had a name. I'm sure it did, but I was never told what it was. And we stayed there for about 45 minutes or so, and then got back in the car. I assumed that when he said we stopped to fix car, that we were getting the car fixed. More to that in a minute. And we went on out to the village where we were supposed to be attending church. Now we got there, and this was different than Murchison. Everybody in the village showed up, but that was about 30 people. It was even pretty obvious that they had been expecting us much earlier, and we had gotten there later. But everybody had shown up, and they waited for us. They'd been sitting there, it turns out I found out, about 2 hours, just waiting to see when we would show up. We get into the church service. It had a good worship service, very similar to what I experienced in Bunyinza, but not quite as much energy because there was a much smaller crowd. And then the pastor starts talking, both in the local language and then translated into English. He talks for a little bit, and the younger fellow looks over at me and goes, what did he say? And I leaned over to him and I said, well, turns out you and I are giving speeches and preaching some today. He looks at me and goes, I don't know that I'm ready for that. And I'm like, well, you need to get ready because that's what we're doing. I don't remember what he said. I don't even remember what I said, but we did our part. Everyone seemed to be appreciative of it. And we closed out the church service there. Then the people in the area, they did a couple of really just significant gestures that I'm never going to forget. One, they brought out their village stash of soda pop, carbonated beverage, sweetened, whatever you would like to call that generically. At the time, I wasn't drinking soda. In fact, I don't generally. But I wasn't going to refuse it because it was very obvious these soda bottles, they were dusty. They'd been around for a while. They might have been made in the 70s. But that was their visitor stash of important, expensive things that they only brought out on special occasions. So it would have been extremely rude not to take one. And then as we were leaving, we also were each given a chicken to take home with us with its feet tied together with a piece of straw. So we put the chickens in the trunk of the car and started heading back. Now on the way back, we get back to that same village we'd stopped to fix car on the way there, and we stop again. Same place we'd stopped before when we were getting the car fixed. I asked the driver, I'm like, what's up? He's like, oh, they have brought part from Kampala and now we'll put it on car. So here's the interesting thing that had happened. Turns out that what needed fixing was the left front brake caliper on that car. So to make sure they got the right part, on our way there, they took the front brake caliper off the left side of the car, did something to the brake line so it didn't leak fluid all over the place, and sent us on our way. Now we came back and they put the brake caliper back on. We get back in the car. The driver tests it a little bit. Turns around and informs me, stoppies work now. Stoppies is what they call brakes in Uganda. And we went back on our way, got back to the Rock Classic Hotel in Tororo, had chickens for dinner, and had some interesting stories to share with our friends who'd been other places for church that day. Another place that I've gone to church in Uganda is the Paul Devlin Boarding School. That is actually outside of Fort Portal, Uganda, over on the western side. Now, when you go to any of the schools where they have children, they typically want the children to do what they call a program. We would refer to that as a school play in America. So the children come out and they did a play for us on whatever the topic of the day was. They finished their program. Then we started into the worship service. This one was a little bit more tame than the one in Bunyinza. We had some adults from the surrounding villages come. They were all dressed in what they considered their best outfits. Some of those were suits that had seen better days and things. They dressed up with what they have. We were still there for several hours for that worship experience. And then once that was over, we all packed up, and the interesting part of that experience was at the end of the service, folks who had walked there now wanted to pile into whatever vehicle we could so they could hitch a ride home and drop off closer to where they came from on the way back. One time in particular, this happened because I did a lot of work with Paul Devlin School when I lived in Uganda in 2014. And I had this ambulance that I'll talk about in another episode that I'd gotten running. It was a Land Rover Defender. It was a cool car to have in Uganda. But anyway, one day we were out there at church, Paul Devlin School, and everybody wanted a ride home, and they were like jockeying for position. It got to the point where I had so many people in that ambulance that I was worried as whether or not the suspension was going to carry the load. I think I had like 14 or 15 people standing up in the back of the ambulance. There were 2 or 3 or 4 people sitting up front on each other's laps and stuff. And on the way back, we were stop here, stop here, stop here, and letting people get out of the ambulance and go on their way. Another place I have been to church in Uganda is Karbarole Kingdom Hall in Fort Portal, Uganda. That's probably the closest to what I would call a American megachurch that I have seen in Africa. It's a large building. It's out in the downtown area of Fort Portal, kind of off. Fort Portal's kind of hard to describe if you've never been to Africa. I'll think about how to put it in words when I describe some more things in Africa episodes. But there were hundreds of people that would come in. They had 3 services a day. They had 2 of those that were delivered in a local language, 1 in English. And typically at the English, they also had a translator as well. Now, when I'm showing up there, it was actually, I was walking through downtown Fort Portal. I had gotten up late that day. Truth be told, I'd actually had a few too many Nile Specials, which is one of the local beers, the night before, and I was hungover and just didn't make it up in time to get to the English service. And I passed a guy as I was walking down to my mechanic friend's house, Kakande, to talk to him. And the guy said, "Are you going to prayers?" That means, are you going to church in Uganda? And I said, "Well, I think I missed it." He said, "Oh no, they have another service." So I said, "Fine, I'll go over." Now, this was supposed to be the service taught in the local language. When you're a foreigner in Uganda, the term they use for is Mzungu. One of the meanings I've been told for that is white with cash. Also been told it means one with wanders, but typically you're assumed to be fairly wealthy if you are a Mzungu in Uganda. So I show up at this service. I got there a little bit late. I went in and I actually sat down out in the congregation. I was later told by a friend of mine, Tom Eggum, he's like, "Yeah, you got to be careful doing that because you were probably distracting everybody around you because they're not used to seeing you at their services, and you were a big distraction to them." During the service, I was asked to go up front and sit in the special seat, and I declined. Knowing what I know now, I would probably take that up because I don't want to be a distraction to other people. But then after the service, it seemed very weird. I was summoned off to meet with the lead pastor of that church, and he wanted to talk to me. I am not sure exactly why. I think it was because he thought I might be able to give him some donations, but we had a good conversation. I enjoyed the service. I think God and Jesus enjoyed the service too. And went on about my day. The final place I'm going to talk about going to church in Africa is at the Rock Classic Bar in Karbarole, Uganda. And this is one of the lessons I learned that actually brought what does church really mean home to me. There was this girl, Elizabeth, who was going on mission trips with us with Hope for Kids at the time, who was over there a lot. And there are a lot of people on those trips from the Anthem, Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona area, because that's where Hope for Kids is based out of. Someone who knew Elizabeth both in America and from Africa was asking her, "Hey, why don't I ever see you at church in America?" And Elizabeth turns and looks at them and she says, "This is my church." And that put a whole big new perspective on me, because I had been, like I think many people do, thinking of church as a place you go, not a lifestyle you live. Some of my thoughts on church in Africa, a lot of times to me it just seems like a more authentic experience than going to church in America ever has to me. There are a lot of people in abject poverty. They have lots of situations that most people wouldn't put up with in America, but yet they seem so much closer to God than I've ever seen people in America. And maybe that's because they have to be. I truly wish I could find an environment like this in America. Maybe I will. Maybe some of you will hear this. We'll get together and set something up. I honestly am trying to go back to Africa. That is one of the things that motivated me to go to PA school and be able to. I have not had the chance to yet, but Nancy and I, if we can figure out how to make it happen, we are going to try to get that going on within the next year or two. That is going to do it for today. I really appreciate you listening. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to the podcast, to like the podcast, and putting up with it as we slowly get going to where we want things to be. The background music Perspectives was created by Kevin McLeod at incompetech.com. It is licensed under the Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. The website from which the music was downloaded is http://creativecommons.org/licenses/by/4.0. Thank you for listening to Medical Mariner Inc. Medical Mariner Inc. is written, produced, and hosted by me, Paul Stewart. If you wish to make suggestions for content, leave me some comments, or have anything you would like for me to know, you can email me at medicalmarinerinc@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. To support the show, please give me a 5-star rating on whatever platform you listen on, like, and subscribe to the show. Thanks, and I hope you have a good day.